Foundation. A lovely little reminder from our Zoom series. We'll get going in just a moment. All right, we'll go ahead and kick it off. We've got some folks watching on Facebook, and folks will come in. They'll come in when they come in. Thank you for joining us. My name is Caleb Talley. I'm the Director of Marketing for the Startup Junkie Foundation. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, we are a mission-driven organization based in Northwest Arkansas that exists to serve entrepreneurs and innovators and small business owners. We do that largely in two facets. That is through one-on-one consulting at absolutely no cost to the entrepreneur or business owner, and then through events, workshops, networking events, educational events, things just like this, where you have the opportunity to hear from some Arkansas leaders and those who are doing great things in our state. We appreciate y'all for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Marcy Doderer, President and CEO of Arkansas Children's. Marcy is like I just said, President and CEO of Arkansas Children's, where she leads the state's only pediatric health system serving 700,000 children in Arkansas. A dynamic leader, Marcy is focused on improved child health by advancing patient care, building community, and championing excellence through digital transformation, engaged in efficient partnerships, and bold child advocacy. Under Marcy's leadership, Arkansas Children's transformed from one hospital into a health system with 2 hospitals, a research institute, and a philanthropic foundation, regional clinics and alliances, telemedicine, and statewide outreach programs. She has led the organization with an unwavering focus on the core values of safety, teamwork, and compassion and excellence. Marcy, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, good evening, Caleb. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's start off with our first question. I'm curious, Marcy, what led you to a career in healthcare?
It's funny, when people ask me this, I always preface it with saying it's kind of a corny story because it's true. I was a college junior majoring in business and finance, really had great dreams around international business, had my eye set on international banking in particular. I'd lived overseas and thought I'd go back. And by the end of my junior year, I was bored silly. And I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I was in college in Little Rock, but my dad was a physician here at Arkansas Children's. And I came home that spring and talked to the CEO of Arkansas Children's about what healthcare meant as a business and an industry, because I was taking an elective in that area. And he said, why don't you come work for me this summer and find out firsthand what it's like to work in healthcare from a non-clinician's perspective. And so that summer of 1988, when I was 20 years old, not quite 21, I worked at Arkansas Children's as a summer intern and went back and changed my complete focus, told my advisor I was going to go into healthcare and I was going to run a children's hospital someday. And 8 years later, I came back to Arkansas to run a children's hospital. And it's a true story. I'm not exaggerating any of those pieces.
So the rest, as they say, is history, I guess. Mentioned that, Arkansas Children's is the only pediatric healthcare system in the state of Arkansas, but what differentiates Arkansas Children's from other pediatric hospitals across the country?
We're probably more alike than we are different. Children's hospitals come in a variety of shapes and sizes. We have what we call the independent children's hospitals that Arkansas Children's sits within, meaning we're not owned by an adult health system. We are self-governed with our own set of boards, independently financed by ourselves. There are children's hospitals within health systems. Think about Riley Children's Hospital in Indianapolis, owned by a big adult health system. Stanford Children's, owned by big Stanford Health. And then there are children's hospitals within hospitals. So in the Detroit world, in the University of Michigan world, they have a big kind of children's concern, but it's not a freestanding, separately governed children's hospital. And so we fall in that category of independent children's hospitals. There's only about 35 of them left in the country. And to qualify or to really categorize yourself as that, there's several things that drive us that kind of define us. It's a 4-part mission. It's patient care, of course. It's research, it's education, training the next generation of healthcare professionals, and it's advocacy, being a voice for children since children don't vote. And I think that's what defines us the most. What might make us different than some of the other children's hospitals in that same category across our country is we do represent the whole state, and there are not very many children's hospitals like that. I can think of a couple of states that really only have one pediatric health system dedicated to the care of kids. Most states have more than one now. So that's unique, that we really kind of, at our core mission, feel an obligation to reach out across all 75 counties to think about how we might impact all 700,000 children, even if they never walk our halls. How do we advocate for further research, educate providers, and deliver care such that any child in Arkansas might reach their fullest potential, because we at Arkansas Children's are here for them.
And obviously, the past year and a half has been a challenge for any healthcare system. So I'm curious how Arkansas Children managed through the pandemic, and this is probably a 2 or 3-parter question. How Arkansas Children's managed through the pandemic, and what challenges were exposed during that time, and how did you overcome them?
And though I appreciate your choice of words, managing through the pandemic, and I think many of us opt for that kind of language, the reality is it's not over. It's not done. And though we're kind of in another trough, it looks like, for the number of active patients with COVID in hospitals in Arkansas, managing within this pandemic is far from over. I will literally never forget, I think, the day I sat at a conference table with a few of my execs to be on a conference call with the Arkansas Department of Health to learn that the first patient in Arkansas had been diagnosed with COVID, and that actually one of the medical team members that cared for that very first patient was one of our team members who was now back in our hospital and literally was upstairs in an empty room feeling very ill, only to become probably one of the first medical providers to also be diagnosed with COVID in our state. And I looked at my team who sat there with me and said, I have no idea what we're going to do. I've never managed a pandemic. Holy cow, what do we do now? And language might have been a little different, to be quite honest. But that was March of 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago, and yet it's only been about 18 months. And I think life in hospitals is fundamentally changed forever in how we do some things. So in the moment, we had to stand up a command center. We had to figure out how we were going to ensure a supply chain for masks and gowns and goggles and gloves, the things that kind of became impossible to get at times early on in the pandemic as the supply chain out of Asia was really cut short. We had to think about visitor restrictions. We're a children's hospital. Very, very few children arrive in a children's hospital alone, right? Unlike you or me, we might show up at a hospital by ourselves someday. Kids don't arrive alone. They come with a family or a guardian, even if it's a state advocate. And we had to think about how to restrict entry into our facilities to protect the patients, to protect our team, and to protect other visitors. And that was not an easy choice, and it remains a challenge for us when we restrict visitors in our facilities. We also had challenges around volumes. So early on in the pandemic, kids weren't very affected. The first, what I guess we now would call variants, the first variants of the virus that came through the United States had very little impact on children, making them critically ill. And so we weren't seeing very many children positive and sick with COVID-19. But out of necessity and support of the entire healthcare industry, we shut down elective procedures. We really restricted what kind of business we did. And so we saw our hallways kind of get really empty in spring of 2020, which is kind of scary if you're in the business of taking care of kids, to realize there weren't very many kids coming to you for care. Now, a lot of that shifted over the course of 18 months, and supply chain, even that, we actually were never in a dire situation for supply chain here, but we still to this day every morning check how many days supply on hand we have of masks, of gloves, of gowns, of N95 mask, and of hand sanitizer, believe it or not, because that became really scarce in the early days of the pandemic as well. We've loosened up our visitor restrictions to a degree, but we still don't have just open doors, and we manage our visitors very differently in terms of screening them for their own health concerns and just allowing visitors who might appear ill or feverish or fully understanding they've been exposed to COVID. So some of those things probably will never change. I think one thing that's really, it was an aha moment for us, but it should have also been kind of one of those duh moments, is we stood up a screening process of our own employees. So every day, every employee who's arriving at work at one of our campus fills out a self-attested health screen. You have to take your temperature, you kind of assess yourself for symptoms, you assess whether you've been exposed, you think you've been exposed or not. You enter that, it's an app on our phones, and you submit it to be cleared for duty. And, you know, we've helped employees start to recognize that an old culture of showing up for work with a cold or illness symptoms, which was really, and I think in the United States, really a badge of honor that, no, I can work, really, I can work. Like, that's not acceptable anymore. If you're coughing and sneezing and you have a low-grade temperature, we don't want you anywhere near our hallways. And luckily, we can also work from home so much better now, remote work. But we're also encouraging people to actually take a sick day, to stay home. And I think that is something that is a positive outcome to the pandemic that allows us to relieve that cultural burden that, you know, you should work always, even if you're sick. And now we're like, no, actually, you shouldn't. I could go on and on, but I'll let you go from there.
Absolutely. Well, and you mentioned, you know, just ongoing challenges that you'll still deal with because, to your point, we are still in a pandemic. Challenges open opportunity for you know, innovation, that sort of thing. You mentioned the app for monitoring kind of their health daily. What other role for innovation can you see within a health system like yours?
Well, I think even what we're doing right now, the way to really innovate, not just the technology, because Zoom was around before, right? Microsoft Teams has been around. But I think we're learning to actually leverage those platforms for effective teamwork. And that took a while for my team. And I think, you know, speaking to colleagues around the country, doing this wasn't natural. And I think at times it actually still isn't. And so we've had to really think about how you leverage virtual platforms to still move a body of work forward, to still keep team members engaged, to allow the flexibility of location and time, but to do so while still respecting boundaries between work and home or work and personal life. And I think though it allowed us to maintain a level of work that before the pandemic, we didn't have that muscle memory, we didn't have that skill set for. It's also raised different issues. Like every health system in the country, we took huge leaps and bounds forward with respect to telehealth, whether it was literally telephonic, something that most caregivers wouldn't have thought is very innovative, but we were not in the business of delivering care via a telephone, but also using virtual platforms. And I think there's conflicting stories about how sticky that is going forward. There are certain places and certain populations that accessing care virtually, like you and I are doing, will transcend any future in-person visits. But we're also seeing early evidence that, particularly like in primary care, people actually want to see a doctor or a provider. They actually want that face time. We are social creatures. We are naturally inclined to live in community. That's what people do. And to only ever experience someone via a screen is actually not natural. And so we've seen the ebb and flow of telehealth. I think we'll continue to advance it and perfect it, but it won't be for every patient every time, because some people really want the personal touch and the personal connection that comes with physical presence.
Do you think beyond, I guess, the more commonality of telemedicine, What would you say are some other changes within pediatric care do you see in the next 5 years? What are some potential pivots there strategically that you think are probably ongoing or will continue?
So, what's different in pediatrics than in the adult world that makes it hard to just completely adopt technological interventions that allow a person to stay out of the healthcare physical arena is the margin of error with complex children is really tiny. And it's small. Kids don't have the bandwidth of being well, then being not so well, and then being a little bit sick, and then being kind of sick, and then getting really sick. Particularly kids with significant medical complexities, they go from well to very sick in a matter of hours. And that makes providers more uncomfortable with just saying we're going to push to patient wearable devices. I was just reading an article about FDA approved another watch. It's only the second watch that it approves both your blood oxygen levels and your EKG. And I'm thinking, okay, what's the use of that in pediatrics? But I do think home monitoring becomes something that we can be more sophisticated with, and with the power of partnerships. So a child who lives 3 hours from Little Rock, maybe we advance that level of technology there, and in partnership with a local provider, be able to create a safety net for a child that might go sick really fast. Part of my personal story is being the mom of a child with significant medical complexities. She's now a young adult, 23 years old, but I've spent so much time on the parent side of the bed, and I've watched my ventilator-dependent child go to school seemingly well, come home with a fever, and be hospitalized the next day with pneumonia. And that doesn't happen on that steep slope so often with adults. But that's what we have to be careful of in kids, is that limited margin of error. But I think there's some great other ways we can leverage technology and innovation in supporting how care is delivered in schools. Again, virtual platforms, outfitting school nurses with better tools at their fingertips, and then a direct connection to a physician somewhere for the child that looks questionable. I think there's also advancing the technology to help families source access to social services that they need that really surrounds the child to ensure a whole health approach. So looking at closed loop systems to connect families to social agencies to address social determinants of health, like food insecurity, transportation concerns, medical or health literacy, those kinds of things, and building technology that gets a child connected to resources and services faster, more effectively, and with a closed loop back to provider to know that we're actually addressing that social determinant of health. Those are the kind of technologies that we will see, I think, advance at more and more rapid paces in pediatrics.
And I just want to invite anybody that's watching on the Zoom or watching on Facebook, feel free to drop, questions in the comments. If you're watching on Facebook, we'll get to those later. I don't want anybody to think that I'm going to steal all the time with Marcy today. And to get some questions that I know some of our entrepreneurial audience will be interested in hearing about. We talk about culture and workplaces as people develop, start and grow businesses. Tell me a little bit about the culture at Arkansas Children's.
So I think it's a culture that continues to be in transition. I've been here 8 years right now, and by most experts in culture transformation, at least what the literature says, you need 5 to 7 years to transfer a culture. I'd say I got heavily started in that in year 2 of my work here, maybe year 3. So we're still evolving. To that end, though, I'm confident that we've secured a culture that that is really grounded by the core values you mentioned in my introduction. To me, that is a vital piece of who I am as a leader, and my own kind of leadership philosophy, that everything starts and ends with the core values of the institution. Ideally, you'd like to have a workforce whose personal values mesh perfectly with the corporate values. But if they don't, you need a culture that helps them find that middle ground and sees where people connect. And you read you read our values in order, and part of my culture is being true to those words, and it means we say them and we write them in the same order every time. It is safety, teamwork, compassion, and excellence, and that's a purposeful order and a purposeful process. Everything we do starts with safety for the patients we take care of, and safety for our team members who are delivering that care every day. And it's bookended by excellence, that we are going to strive for an excellent outcome, an excellent process, an excellent output every time. But none of that happens without the people in the middle. So that's why the teamwork and the compassion are in the middle. And people might call that corny, but the thing is, our team members, if you talk to them, they actually say the core values in that same order. Another piece of the culture that I think is incredibly important for me is the authenticity of the leaders who come to that table, who are actually really role modeling and delivering on that culture every day. It can't be a facade. It can't be questionable in the eyes of the people who are walking the halls with you. And so for me, some might describe me as, ambitious and driven and those kinds of things. And that's true. That's actually very much a part of who I am. And that's why there's that core value of excellence. I don't really like to tolerate the statement, good is good enough. And I have worked for bosses actually prior in my life who's used those phrases, and it didn't work very well for me because I don't relate well to that. So there's a level of drive, a level of expectation and results setting and results achievement that is built into those core values, but it does come back to the values. So when we're sorting through a list of strategic imperatives or what could be potential strategic imperatives, or we're evaluating a partner with whom we'd like to do business, the filter of the core values is one of the first things that's applied to that decision making. Will it disrupt our core values? Will it disrupt who we are? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably not the right strategic imperative. It's probably not the right business partner. And that's not a reflection on the strategy or a reflection on the potential partner. It's just what is. It's not good or bad. It's just what is.
And so how do you, when you are hiring for those roles within Arkansas Children's, how do you go about, I guess, searching for those people that mesh with those core values, and how do you square that versus hiring for skill and then, I guess, teaching them that culture? Or do you hire for core culture that, they already meet those standards?
It is a blend. We are an industry that requires an intense level of technical competency. If we're going to hire a PharmD, a pharmacist that's just approving and writing order, or approving the orders for, approving the development of the medications that land in a child's veins, we need a level of precision there. So there is a blend with making sure they've got that technical competency, but we also try to teach and model what's called behavioral interviewing style, so you can really get to who the person is. I still believe that the interview is about a 50-50 chance of finding the right person. I think it's really hard, particularly for smart, skilled people. They know what answer to put out there to the interviewer. But you can get there with some of the behavioral kind of questions, which start with, Caleb, can you tell me about a time when you actually had to have a really difficult conversation with a client? And how did you maneuver that? And did it go well? And if that one went well, then I want to hear about a time you had a really difficult conversation with a client that didn't go well. Now, you could still make up a story, right? When I ask you that kind of question, but you'd have to be really good on your feet. And so most of the time, people come back with authentic stories, and you can start to see how they manage through difficult situations, how they manage change. Did they put safety first? Do they even talk about the patient in the center of their conversation? Were they driving for a level of results? So you can get there. And then I think the other challenge right now in the workforce is, I don't know the exact stat anymore, but in the next 10 years, like half the jobs that'll be here 10 years from now don't exist today. So there are some things we cannot hire for technical competency for because we don't actually know what the jobs are going to be. And so for me, that's actually a cooler part of the interview process, is assessing for someone's learning agility, their ability to absorb information and how quickly they can apply it. Listening for and asking questions about curiosity and kind of a sense of discovery, because if we don't know the next job, we actually need people who have potential, not skill set. And so I've been known to ask questions about, tell me the last time you learned something new. It doesn't have to be about work. And it's funny, you get crazy answers of, person had a daughter going into volleyball. So she said, I learned all the rules of volleyball so that I could coach my own daughter from the sidelines. And, other people will tell you about a work skill set, and others will tell you, well, I decided to learn to knit during the pandemic because I needed something to do with my hands because I had all of this nervous energy. And it's just trying to see, do people actually learn something new? Are they a lifetime learner? That feeds into their ability as a potential, how will they grow in that potential job that doesn't exist today?
Absolutely. Well, you gave us some exceptional advice for the interviewing process as a leader. What advice might you have aside from the hiring process for emerging healthcare leaders or somebody that wants to be in a CEO role, whether it's healthcare or not, but somebody that sees themselves heading in that direction?
So I would offer that if someone's really interested in advancing their career, they want to be ambitious and scaling the corporate ladder or whatever you want to call it these days, a couple of things. Rarely, if ever, say no to an opportunity. So when you are young in your career or new in an organization or mid-management in an organization and someone offers you an opportunity to grab a new project, sit in on a meeting that you've never been a part of before, do something like that. My own experience was I never said no. And it never dawned on me. And now I see younger people ask me like, well, does that come with more pay? Like, it never dawned on me to ask that question. Maybe I should have at some point, but don't do it because it comes with compensation. Do it because you're going to learn something that you can apply to your next job. And I think don't ever be afraid to acknowledge that you don't know something. That's one of the key attributes of true authenticity is being able to sit back and go, I have no clue how we're going to land this world in a pandemic. I have no idea how we're going to do that. A lot of leaders and a lot of people are really afraid to admit they've never done something or they don't know how to do it because the world expects such this perfect person. And I think actually it's ironic that we're on Facebook, and nothing against Facebook, but that social media actually delivers a facade of perfection so often, right? And yet in the workplace, you need to be able to roll up your sleeves and say, I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to go learn, because there's a wealth of resources to learn this stuff. And so being willing to admit you don't know something, but showing you have the ability to learn it, always jumping in when offered an opportunity. And then don't be afraid when you fail a time or two. Dust off, make some notes to yourself about what you learned from that and go forward. And then the very last piece of advice that a prior CEO of mine gave me was you want to always be prepared for the next job, and you don't know when it's coming. So make a habit that once a year you update your resume. And when I share that with people here, they get really nervous. If you've updated resume, does it mean you're going? No, but you never know when you might be asked to send your resume off to somewhere. It might be because you're looking for a new job. It might be because someone wants to interview you. But if it's not up to date, you're going to scramble to make it up to date, and then it might not be thoughtful. Whereas if you make it an annual process, you can really take time, reflect on the results of the past year, distill that down to 3 bullets or something that you really want on the resume or your CV. And then it's always good to go when someone comes knocking and say, hey, you want to be the next executive director? You can prove to them why you're ready for that role.
Absolutely. Our next question was one that was submitted in advance by a potential listener or somebody who's tuning in. What would the bedside nurse, respiratory therapist, or other Arkansas Children's employee say about Marcy?
Well, to my face, or I think in general, I have a very good working relationship with our teams. I don't know everyone's name. There's more than 4,500 of them, but I do think they know who I am when I'm walking down the hall. I think most of them would know that I'm true to my word, and that's an important tenet to me, that words matter, so that I fulfill the obligations I say I'm going to. I think they'd say I was mostly approachable, but pretty demanding. I set the bar high. I think they'd say I have a level of compassion for our work that you don't always find in a CEO, and it goes back to being a mom. And most of our team members know my story. They ask about it. I tell that story. I use it as examples, and have actually used my personal experience walking the halls as a parent to change policy and practice for how we deliver care. And I think many of our team members know that.
Awesome. And then I have a question on the chat via Facebook. Martha asked, what do you think is the biggest medical innovation coming to the children's health arena in the next few years that excites you the most, like a new cancer treatment or device or medical therapy?
You know, I'm not a clinician, right? No, I think there's several things that are probably coming down the pike that are going to be really transformative. There is, it's not necessarily new technology in the world of cancer treatment, but when we get to CAR T-cell transplantation, and really that level of technology is becoming more and more accessible to not just the largest academic health centers across the country. And so even in Arkansas, that's on our 3-year horizon here. So I think the advancement of some of those technologies is becoming easier to apply in smaller states. It's becoming more affordable to apply in places like Arkansas Children's, rather than just in Boston or Stanford or Seattle. And I think that's going to accelerate care for kids dramatically. There's also a lot of work happening, and we'll see if they're successful, but around really novel pediatric medications. And this is a big pain point for healthcare providers right now. So many medications are developed and designed for adults and then, transformed to kids. And if they come, they're incredibly expensive. Our latest access to a pediatric novel drug is literally $2 million a dose. I signed an invoice last week or week before for that. That's not sustainable. And there are a handful of people in the country trying to figure out how to create US-based, so stateside manufacturing of these hard to find pediatric-centric medications. And I think that just that's a game changer for us from a cost standpoint, from a process standpoint, that we're not having to source from a variety of different places where you can end up with a regular supplier. So I think some of those things are really on the forefront. The genetic solutions for kids, really understanding what's the genetic mutation a child experiences, and then knowing are there ways to correct that or enhance that child's life. Those advancements are happening, annually, if not more frequently, in healthcare for kids too. When even in the 23 years I've been the mom of Katie, when she was born, it was a diagnosis by exclusion. She has a genetic mutation. There's about 1,200 kids in the world with her mutation. But it wasn't mapped genetically 23 years ago. And probably when she was between 5 and 7 years old, they finally finished that genetic mapping. And so now actually it can be a test done in utero. So a family would actually know in advance if their kid's going to have CHS, or at least when the baby's born and they're it's symptomatic, there's a genetic test and you can get closer or more rapidly to treatment. Whereas Katie was 4 or 5 months old before they guessed this was her particular diagnosis, because it was diagnosis by exclusion, because they didn't know what gene to look for then. So 20 years doesn't sound like, or sometimes sounds like a terribly long time, but in the world of healthcare, that's a fleeting moment, and to see that kind of advancement. And I think that's just going to keep accelerating.
Well, I've got 2 more questions that I have prepared left, but so I'm going to ask the next one and give everyone who's watching on Facebook and elsewhere their opportunity to ask their question. I think on Zoom it might be a hand raised type thing. I'm not sure on the webinar. But my next question is, we have a lot of readers, books, podcasts, listeners. What would you say are some books that you would recommend to emerging leaders, or podcasts, or whatever it is?
So might be considered a blasphemous thing to tell you, but though I am an avid reader, and I own a ton of leadership books, and I've read a lot of leadership books, I don't know that there's one particular book that everyone in the world should read. so many leadership books have pearls of wisdom, but they can be really hard to get through. And so I think you have to, the individuals needs to understand what they're looking for in a leadership book. Now, that said, I have a couple of kind of foundational books that I think you can't go wrong with. One of them, the author just left my head, but it's called Difficult Conversations. Now, in management books, in management courses in schools, you'll always hear about fierce conversations and crucial conversations. So those get the big, wag from universities. There's a much smaller book, and it's paperback. It's called Difficult Conversations, and it's not written in business speak. And it is a fabulous tool for learning how to have a really challenging conversation with a coworker, an employee, or even your spouse. There's another book that's really a philosophy. Oh, I just got some cheating help. Difficult Conversations by Douglas Stone. There's another little philosophy book that I think is one of the best leadership books ever, but you're not going to find it on a leadership or a management bookshelf. You're going to find it in philosophy, and it's about the Toltec Indians in central Mexico, and it's called The Four Agreements. And I did write down that author's name, Don Miguel Ruiz. It was a gift to me from the vice president of mission at Christus Health when I worked there. And it's really, again, it's a philosophy book. It's a bit spiritual. It's not religious, but it speaks to how one should lead your life. And I have found it invaluable. So the four agreements are words matter. So be impeccable to your word. Don't take it personally, meaning when folks do stuff to you, it's actually not about you. And learning how to not take that personally is incredibly helpful. Don't make assumptions. So this gets to the curiosity and the discovery attributes I've talked about. Ask a lot of questions. Don't assume you know why something's coming at you. And the fourth is always be your best. And recognize your best will be different on any given day. They're not equal. If you don't feel good, if you woke up on the wrong side, if your child stuck their tongue out at you, your best that day will be different than when you wake up and you had your Wheaties and you've had your orange juice and you feel awesome. But be your best every day. And so I think that book, The Four Agreements, can take anyone anywhere. And it's something I go back to not infrequently and have gifted it many times.
Sounds great. To your point, some of the best business books or books for people in business aren't necessarily business books with business speak. From so-called experts, more so people that have lived the journey and impart some knowledge.
And I think if you're anywhere in your career, you also have to give yourself a little grace about how you go about learning. So, if you are someone who's devoting 12 or 14 hours a day to work and you have a life outside of work, reading these thick leadership books might not be the best way you want to spend your time, or you may not find that that's a good way to spend your time. And there's ways to read journals online, or I actually still like regular magazines, in your industry. There are TED Talks that are 10, 15, 20 minutes long. There are podcasts that are helpful. And I think people need to give themselves a bit of grace. Don't think that to succeed as a CEO, you have to have read 42 business books or leadership books before you ascend to that executive level. Personally, with the little free time I have, I'd much rather read a spy novel than a leadership book, because that's my escape, right? But I think there's all sorts of ways to learn from certainly the experts in our field and those that have published around it, but it doesn't always have to come in the form of a book.
Well, you teed up the perfect opportunity for me to plug the Startup Junkie podcast, in which we talk about these sorts of things with people from all across the state and country. And one of the questions we always ask people that are on our podcast is kind of how we conclude each episode. And I guess I'll conclude this session with you with this final question, because I don't see any more on the Facebook here. But Marcy, if you could go back in time, maybe it's before you came to Arkansas Children's, maybe it's, before you started your healthcare career, if you could give advice to your younger self, you've got a crystal ball knowing everything that you know now, what advice might that be?
So I would offer two pieces of advice to my younger self. The first is around patience, and I could have learned how to be a more patient individual earlier. And probably many would still not describe me as a very patient person, but patient to allow people to process things in a way that I don't necessarily do. Patience to allow teams to work and struggle through to solutions, even if I believe I already know it or want them to go in a different way. And I think that if you, as leading people, you have to give people the space to do their own work, even if it's really messy. And that takes an incredible amount of patience to allow that process to happen outside your control. I actually have a rock on my windowsill that was given to me by one of my direct reports back when I was in Texas that says patience on it. And I have to hold it occasionally to remind myself about that. The other thing I would offer is in the requirement of receiving feedback and constructive criticism, and in the gift of receiving feedback or constructive criticism, to take it in the middle of the lane. Do not take it too seriously, but also don't take it flippantly. But you can't absorb all that kind of feedback and constructive criticism you'll get over the course of a career and have to own every word of it, because I think it can eat you up. But it is really important to be open and accepting of constructive criticism and feedback. And so you cannot also just blow it off. But there are pieces of it that you're going to want to say, I'm going to go back to the 4 agreements, and that is, I'm not going to take one personally. And stay in the middle road when it comes to feedback, but receive it as a gift.
That's an excellent answer. And this has been an excellent conversation. Marcy, I greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to join us and impart some wisdom to our viewers, which will live on our YouTube channel for those who want to, share with others or, go back and review. Thank you all for tuning in, whether it's here with us right now on Zoom or on Facebook. Hope you will tune in to future Startup Junkie events. Again, Marcy, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope people found at least one little nugget of valuable information to help make their tomorrow a brighter one. So thank you so much, Caleb.
I'm sure they did. Everybody have a good evening. Bye, y'all.